February 19th, 1945, Green Beach, Iwo Jima. Private First Class Takeo Watanabe pressed his eye against the firing slit of his concrete bunker, watching the first wave of American landing craft approach through the black volcanic ash and sea spray. He had spent 9 months preparing these defenses, digging tunnels 7 levels deep into Mount Suribachi, positioning machine guns in interlocking fields of fire that would turn the beach into a slaughterhouse. His commander, Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi, had assured the 2,000 defenders that the Americans would break against these fortifications like waves against a cliff. The plan was perfect. Let them land. Let them crowd the beaches, then unleash everything. At 0900 hours, the 1st Marines from the 28th Regiment hit Green Beach and began pushing inland through sand so deep it swallowed men to their ankles with every step. Watanabe's fingers tightened on his weapon. Any moment now, the signal would come. Any moment. And the killing would begin. What happened next would shatter every assumption Japanese intelligence had made about how Marines responded when trapped against an enemy they could not see, on terrain that favored defenders with overwhelming advantages, facing fortifications that military doctrine said were impenetrable. But the Marines of the 28th Regiment were about to demonstrate something that no Japanese commander at any level had truly understood. They were not coming to test the defenses. They were coming to take Mount Suribachi, and they would pay any price necessary to do it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The deception began not on Iwo Jima, but in the strategic calculations made by Japanese Imperial Headquarters during the autumn of 1944. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, newly appointed commander of Iwo Jima's defenses, had studied American amphibious operations with meticulous detail. He had reviewed the battles at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. He had read intelligence reports describing Marine tactics, casualty tolerance, and assault procedures. From this analysis, he had concluded something that would define his entire defensive strategy. The Americans could be stopped if you made them pay enough in blood during the initial landing. Kuribayashi was not like other Japanese commanders who had squandered their forces in banzai charges and glorious but futile gestures. He was a realist who understood that Japan could not win the Pacific War through spirit alone. But he believed deeply that if Iwo Jima's defenders inflicted sufficient casualties during the landing phase, American public opinion would turn against the island-hopping campaign. The entire strategic value of seizing islands closer to Japan would be questioned if the price became too high. This calculation was not unreasonable. American casualty rates at Tarawa had horrified citizens back home. Photographs of dead Marines floating in the surf had appeared in newspapers across the United States, raising questions about whether these costly assaults were necessary. Kuribayashi planned to give America thousands more such photographs. He would turn Iwo Jima's 8 square miles into the most heavily fortified position in military history. His engineers spent months creating a defensive network that seemed impregnable. They dug 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting 1,500 cave positions and concrete bunkers. They positioned artillery pieces in caves, where naval bombardment could not reach them. They created firing positions that overlapped so perfectly that no advance across any section of beach would be possible without walking into multiple machine gun kill zones simultaneously. Every meter of Iwo Jima's southern beaches had been measured, registered for mortar fire, and prepared to become a death trap. The crown jewel of this defensive network was Mount Suribachi itself, the 550-foot dormant volcano that dominated the southern tip of the island. Colonel Atsuchi commanded 2,000 troops dug into positions throughout the mountain. The Japanese had honeycombed Suribachi with gun emplacements, observation posts, and tunnels that ran deep into the volcanic rock. Artillery observers positioned at the summit could see every inch of the landing beaches and call down fire with devastating accuracy. Machine gun positions covered every approach from multiple angles. The mountain had been transformed into a fortress that conventional military wisdom said would require weeks to capture if it could be taken at all. Japanese military planners understood that controlling Suribachi meant controlling the southern third of Iwo Jima. Any American force that landed while Japanese guns remained operational on that mountain would be under constant observation and fire. Logistics operations would be impossible. Reinforcements could not land safely. Medical evacuation would become suicidal. The Americans would have to take Suribachi before they could advance north toward the airfields that were the invasion's primary objective. Kuribayashi's plan assumed this would take at least 2 weeks of bloody fighting. By then, American casualties would be so catastrophic that continuation of the offensive might become politically impossible. What Japanese intelligence had failed to understand was that the 28th Marine Regiment approaching Green Beach had been specifically trained for exactly this mission. Colonel Harry Liversedge, who commanded the regiment, had received preliminary plans for Iwo Jima back in October of 1944. He had spent 3 months drilling his men for an amphibious assault on heavily fortified volcanic terrain. The training had been brutal, designed to prepare Marines for the worst combat conditions imaginable. They had practiced assault tactics on mock-ups of Japanese defensive positions. They had learned to move through deep sand while carrying heavy equipment. They had drilled on coordinating infantry advances with supporting artillery and armor. Most importantly, they had internalized a single non-negotiable objective: take Suribachi, no matter the cost. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 28th Marines hit Green Beach just after 0900 hours on February 19th. For several minutes, they encountered almost no resistance. This was exactly as Kuribayashi had planned. Let the Americans fill the beaches. Let them crowd together in the killing zone, then open fire when escape became impossible. Private First Class Watanabe watched through his firing slit as hundreds of Marines pushed inland, struggling through volcanic sand that made every movement exhausting. The beach was becoming crowded with men and equipment exactly as Japanese defensive doctrine predicted. Then the signal came. Every gun position on Mount Suribachi and throughout the southern defensive sector opened fire simultaneously. The effect was devastating. Machine gun fire swept across the beaches in interlocking patterns that caught Marines in the open with no cover. Mortars began falling with terrifying accuracy, their explosions throwing black sand and shrapnel in all directions. Artillery shells from positions deep inside. Suribachi crashed into landing craft, still approaching the shore, sending men and equipment into the cold Pacific water. Within minutes, the beaches were covered with dead and wounded Marines. The sand turned dark with blood. Landing craft burned in the surf. The assault appeared to be failing exactly as Japanese planners had predicted, but something was happening that Watanabe could not fully process from his limited view through the bunker's firing slit. The Marines were not retreating. Despite casualties that would have forced any rational military force to withdraw and regroup, the 28th Regiment continued advancing. Squads that lost their sergeants reorganized under corporals who assumed command without waiting for orders. Platoons that suffered 50% casualties pushed forward using whatever cover the volcanic terrain provided. Individual Marines who became separated from their units moved toward the sound of heaviest fire, attaching themselves to any group advancing toward Suribachi. The assault was not stopping. It was adapting. Within 90 minutes of hitting the beach, small units from the 1st and 2nd Battalions had reached the west coast of Iwo Jima, cutting across the narrowest section of the island. This achievement was not in Japanese defensive plans. Kuribayashi had expected the initial assault to stall completely under the weight of defensive fire. Instead, the Marines had accomplished their first objective by mid-morning, despite taking horrific casualties in the process. By late afternoon, the 28th Marines had isolated Mount Suribachi from the rest of the island, establishing positions that prevented Japanese reinforcements from reaching Atsuchi's garrison. The volcano was now surrounded, cut off from support, and under assault from a regiment that had already demonstrated it would not stop regardless of losses. The 3rd Battalion came ashore at 1300 hours, fighting through devastating fire to reach the beach. Their casualties in the water and crossing the sand were appalling, but the survivors pushed inland immediately, taking up positions that strengthened the perimeter around Suribachi. By nightfall on the first day, the 28th Marines held a continuous line cutting off the mountain from Japanese forces further north. This was the only regiment that landed on D-Day to achieve all its designated objectives. The price had been terrible. Nearly 2,000 casualties in the first 24 hours, including 558 dead. But the mission was accomplished. Suribachi was isolated. Inside his bunker, Private First Class Watanabe struggled to understand what had just occurred. The Americans had walked into prepared defensive positions designed by some of Japan's best military engineers. They had suffered casualties that should have broken any unit's will to continue. Yet they had taken every objective assigned for the first day of combat. The defensive plan that was supposed to stop the Marines at the water's edge had failed completely. Japanese forces still held Suribachi itself, but they were now surrounded with no possibility of reinforcement or escape. Everything depended on whether the 2,000 defenders could hold the mountain long enough for the Americans to lose heart and withdraw. That night, as Marines dug foxholes in the volcanic sand and prepared for inevitable Japanese counterattacks, Colonel Liversedge established his command post and began planning the assault on Suribachi proper. His regiment had achieved the impossible on the first day, but the hardest fighting lay ahead. The mountain was honeycombed with defensive positions that would have to be taken one by one. Every cave entrance, every bunker, every firing position would cost lives. Intelligence estimates suggested the battle for Suribachi would last at least a week, possibly longer. What those estimates could not account for was the transformation that occurred in Marines who had already proven they could take any objective despite the cost. February 20th, 1945, D+1. The assault on Mount Suribachi began at first light with the methodical destruction of Japanese defensive positions identified during the previous day's fighting. The 28th Marines did not attack with dramatic Banzai-style charges or theatrical gestures. They advanced using coordinated fire and movement, with each squad covering another's advance, while demolition teams worked forward to destroy bunkers and seal cave entrances. The progress was measured in yards, sometimes in feet. Every position had to be cleared individually. Every tunnel entrance had to be explored or sealed with explosives. The fighting was savage and intensely personal. Corporal Hisashi Nakamura commanded a machine gun position dug into Suribachi's southern slope. His orders were simple: kill as many Marines as possible before the position was overrun. Hold until death. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no quarter given or expected. He watched through the gun's sight as Marines advanced toward his position, using suppressive fire from rifles and light machine guns to keep defenders' heads down, while demolition teams crawled forward carrying satchel charges and flamethrowers. The tactics were professional and ruthlessly effective. When Nakamura's gun opened fire, Marine squads immediately took cover and called in supporting artillery that began dropping shells around his position with terrifying accuracy. The integration of supporting arms that Marines demonstrated shocked Japanese defenders who had expected infantry attacks supported by distant artillery. Instead, every squad seemed to have direct communication with batteries firing from ships offshore or artillery positions being established on the beaches. Forward observers accompanied assault teams, calling in fire missions that arrived within minutes of being requested. When a bunker stopped a Marine advance, naval gunfire from destroyers positioned offshore would begin systematically destroying the position with 5-inch shells delivered with devastating precision. The combination of aggressive infantry tactics and overwhelming fire support made Japanese defensive positions untenable. Corporal Nakamura's machine gun nest held out for 3 hours before a Marine flamethrower team reached effective range. The weapon that Japanese soldiers feared more than any other sent streams of burning liquid into the position's firing ports. The temperature inside the bunker became unbearable within seconds. Nakamura and his crew had 3 choices: burn to death inside the position, exit and be killed by Marines waiting outside, or somehow survive long enough to be captured, which Japanese military culture considered worse than death. Most chose to fight until the flames or bullets killed them. This scene repeated across Suribachi's slopes hundreds of times during the first days of the assault. The progress the 28th Marines made on D+1 was minimal by traditional military standards. They advanced perhaps 200 yards against the mountain's defenses. But every yard cost Japanese defenders positions they could not replace. Every bunker destroyed was one fewer obstacle the Marines would face advancing upward. The casualties on both sides were horrific, but the Americans possessed advantages that made the outcome mathematically inevitable. They had unlimited ammunition. They had artillery support that Japanese forces could not match. They had air superiority that allowed them to call in bombing strikes against any target. Most importantly, they had replacement troops arriving daily to replace casualties, while Japanese defenders had only the 2,000 men originally positioned on the mountain. By evening of D+2, the 28th Marines had surrounded Mount Suribachi except for 400 yards along the west coast. The casualties for that day's fighting included 5 officers and 101 Marines killed or wounded, many of them key personnel. A mortar shell landing in the regimental command post killed Lieutenant Commander Daniel McCarthy, the surgeon, along with several specialists, whose loss significantly degraded the regiment's effectiveness. But the advance continued. The ring around Suribachi tightened with mechanical inevitability. Japanese defenders recognized that breakthrough reinforcement was impossible. They were going to die on this mountain. The only question was how many Marines they would kill before the position fell completely. Private First Class Watanabe had survived the first 2 days of fighting, but his bunker was now isolated and surrounded. Supply tunnels that connected his position to other defensive sites had been sealed by Marine demolition teams. He had ammunition for perhaps 2 more hours of fighting. After that, he would have only grenades and his rifle's bayonet. Japanese military doctrine was very clear about what soldiers should do when capture became inevitable. Death before dishonor. Fight to the last round, then die attacking the enemy with whatever weapons remained. Surrender was not an option that existed within the code of Bushido that every Japanese soldier had internalized since childhood. What Watanabe did not understand, what none of the Japanese defenders truly comprehended, was that Marines had been trained to a very similar standard. American military culture did not emphasize ritual suicide or death before dishonor in the same explicit way Japanese doctrine did. But the Marine Corps had created through training an equally powerful psychological commitment to mission accomplishment regardless of personal cost. Marines were taught that surrendering an objective was not acceptable, that abandoning wounded comrades was not acceptable, that stopping an advance because of casualties was not acceptable. The training was different in details, but produced warriors just as willing to die, completing their mission as any Japanese soldier following Bushido. The critical difference was that Marines had the industrial capacity of the United States behind them. Japanese soldiers fought with courage and weapons. Marines fought with courage, weapons, and the unlimited resources of American production. When ammunition ran low, more arrived within hours. When casualties mounted, replacements came ashore and moved directly into combat positions. When fire support was needed, battleships offshore could deliver thousands of shells without limitation. The contest was not really between Japanese and American soldiers. It was between Imperial Japan's limited industrial base and America's overwhelming production capacity. Marines were simply the instrument through which that disparity was applied with maximum efficiency. February 23, 1945. D+4. The 28th Marines prepared for the final assault to Suribachi's summit. 4 days of fighting had reduced Japanese defensive capabilities to scattered positions, still capable of resistance, but no longer able to coordinate effective defense. Colonel Atsuchi was dead, killed during fighting on D+2. Command had fragmented among surviving officers, defending isolated positions throughout the mountain. Communications between defensive sites had been severed. Japanese forces on Suribachi were no longer a coordinated garrison. They were individual groups of soldiers, fighting independently with no hope of relief or victory. At 0800 hours, a 40-man patrol from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, began the final climb to Suribachi's summit. Sergeant Michael Strank led the patrol upward through terrain littered with destroyed bunkers and sealed cave entrances. The Marines moved cautiously, expecting ambush at every turn, but Japanese resistance had been broken by 4 days of relentless assault. Scattered defenders still held positions throughout the mountain, but they lacked the coordination and firepower to stop a determined patrol from reaching the top. At 10:20 hours, the patrol reached Suribachi's summit and raised a small American flag brought up for exactly this purpose. The sight of that flag visible from positions across southern Iwo Jima created an emotional response that shocked even hardened combat veterans. Marines who had been fighting for 4 days through some of the most savage combat in the Pacific War began to cry openly. Ships offshore sounded their horns and sirens. Artillery batteries paused their firing while crews watched the flag being raised. For a brief moment, the battle stopped, as everyone recognized the symbolic importance of what had just occurred. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had landed on the beach that morning, watched the flag raising and made a comment that would prove prophetic. The raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. His words captured something that Japanese military planners had completely failed to anticipate. Taking Suribachi was not just a tactical objective, it was a psychological victory that would define American understanding of what Marines could accomplish when given an objective they considered worth any cost. Later that afternoon, a second patrol carried a larger flag to the summit to replace the first. This second flag raising was captured on film by Associated Press. Photographer Joe Rosenthal, in what would become the most famous combat photograph in American history. 6 Marines struggling to raise the flag in a stiff wind became an enduring symbol of American resolve and sacrifice. 3 of those 6 men, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, would be killed in the fighting that continued for 3 more weeks after Suribachi fell. The flag flying atop Mount Suribachi did not mean the battle for the mountain was over. Japanese defenders still held positions throughout Suribachi's tunnels and caves. They would continue fighting for days, emerging at night to attack Marine positions, conducting desperate raids against supply routes, dying in small groups and individual last stands that accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty count. But Suribachi, as a military objective, had fallen. The Americans controlled the summit and were systematically clearing the remaining resistance. The fortress, that was supposed to stop the Marines for weeks, had been taken in 4 days. Private First Class Watanabe died on February 25th in his bunker when Marine demolition engineers sealed the entrance with explosives. He had fought for 6 days without food or water, firing his machine gun at targets of opportunity until ammunition was exhausted, then waiting in darkness for the end that came when tons of rock collapsed the tunnel system and buried him alive. His body would never be recovered. Like thousands of other Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, he simply disappeared into the volcanic rock that became his tomb. There would be no memorial, no recognition, no acknowledgement of his sacrifice beyond a name on a list of soldiers who died defending an island that Japan could not hold against an enemy they could not stop. The casualties the 28th Marines suffered taking Mount Suribachi were catastrophic by any conventional military standard. Company E, which raised both flags at the summit, had landed with 310 men. 75% became casualties. Only 50 men boarded ships when the regiment finally left Iwo Jima 5 weeks later. 7 officers went into battle with the company. Only Captain Dave Severance, the company commander, walked off the island. Every other officer was killed or wounded. These casualty rates would have destroyed most military units' ability to function. The 28th Marines continued attacking northward after Suribachi fell, fighting for 33 more days on the front lines. The impossible had been accomplished, but at a price that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The 28th Marines had demonstrated that American training, firepower, and determination could overcome defenses that military doctrine said were impregnable, but they had also revealed the terrible cost of such victories. Every surviving Marine carried memories of friends who died taking positions that seemed insignificant, bunkers that cost a dozen lives to destroy, cave entrances that killed 20 men to seal, slopes where bodies lay so thick that advancing meant stepping over the dead. These were not glorious battle scenes from propaganda films. This was industrial-scale killing applied with systematic efficiency until one side could no longer continue. Japanese military analysts studying the fall of Mount Suribachi reached conclusions that would alter defensive planning for the remainder of the war. The lesson was not that Marines were supermen immune to bullets or that American firepower was overwhelming, though both were true. The real insight was that Marines operated with a level of tactical coordination and psychological commitment that Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. Every American squad seemed capable of making decisions that Japanese military culture reserved for officers at company or battalion level. This gave Marines a speed of reaction that allowed them to exploit opportunities faster than defenders could respond. The integration of supporting arms that Marines demonstrated was equally important. Japanese defenders had expected artillery and naval gunfire to be delivered in pre-planned barrages that could be predicted and avoided. Instead, Marines called in fire support within minutes of encountering resistance, with accuracy that made holding any position suicidal once it had been identified. The combination of aggressive infantry tactics and overwhelming supporting fire meant that every Japanese defensive position, no matter how well prepared, would eventually be destroyed. The only variable was how long it took and how many Marines died in the process. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The implications extended beyond Iwo Jima to influence Japanese planning for defending Okinawa and the home islands themselves. Could take Suribachi in 4 days against 2,000 defenders in fortifications that represented the best Japanese defensive engineering, then no island in the Pacific could be held indefinitely. The arithmetic was unsustainable. Japan had finite soldiers and limited industrial capacity. America had effectively unlimited replacements and production capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could match. Every battle would end with Japanese defeat and American casualties that could be replaced within weeks. This mathematical certainty created a psychological crisis within Japanese military leadership that would define the final year of the Pacific War. If victory was impossible, what was the purpose of continued resistance? The answer provided to soldiers like Private First Class Watanabe was that they were buying time for the empire through their sacrifice. Every day American forces were delayed was a day Japan had to prepare for the final defense of the home islands. Every Marine killed was one less enemy soldier in the invasion force that everyone knew was coming. This grim calculus transformed Japanese defensive strategy from attempts to win battles into efforts to make American victories so expensive that continuation might become politically impossible. But this strategy had a fatal flaw that Japanese planners never fully appreciated. It assumed American casualties would eventually exceed what the public would tolerate. It assumed that democracy was weak and that citizens of democratic nations would force their governments to negotiate rather than accept continued losses. What this analysis missed was that American public opinion had been hardened by years of war and news from the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor had created a determination to defeat Japan completely that did not diminish as casualties mounted. If anything, high casualties increased American resolve by providing more reasons to ensure that those sacrifices achieved complete victory. The fall of Mount Suribachi demonstrated this dynamic with perfect clarity. The flag raised on the summit became a symbol not of easy victory, but of costly achievement that made final victory non-negotiable. Every American who saw that photograph understood that Marines had died to plant that flag. The image did not create doubt about whether the war should continue. It reinforced determination to finish what those Marines had started. This was exactly the opposite of what Japanese strategy assumed would occur. The 28th Marines who took Suribachi were not mythical supermen. They were young Americans, many still teenagers, who had been transformed by training into warriors capable of accomplishing objectives that seemed impossible. They suffered from fear, exhaustion, and trauma like any soldiers in combat. What made them different was the institutional culture that had been created through decades of Marine Corps tradition and refined through 2 years of Pacific combat. That culture taught that objectives must be taken regardless of cost, that wounded comrades could never be abandoned, and that surrender was not an option that existed within acceptable behavior. Japanese defenders on Suribachi fought with equal courage and determination. They died defending positions they knew could not be held, following orders they understood were suicidal, upholding a code of honor that offered death as the only acceptable outcome. The difference was not in courage or commitment. The difference was in the industrial and logistical support that each side possessed. Marines landed with everything necessary to sustain combat operations indefinitely. Japanese defenders fought with whatever they had brought into their positions before the siege began. When ammunition ran out, when water was exhausted, when food was gone, Japanese soldiers had only their rifles and determination. Marines had unlimited resupply, arriving daily by ship and air. This disparity meant the outcome was never truly in doubt. Once Marines landed on Iwo Jima, Japanese forces could inflict terrible casualties. They could make every position costly to take. They could demonstrate courage and tactical skill that matched anything Americans achieved, but they could not win. The arithmetic of industrial warfare made Japanese defeat inevitable from the moment the first landing craft hit the beaches. Kuribayashi understood this, which was why his orders acknowledged that defenders would die and could only hope to delay American victory rather than prevent it. The flag that flew atop Mount Suribachi represented the moment when this mathematical certainty became visible reality that could not be denied. Japanese forces still held 2/3 of Iwo Jima. They would fight for 3 more weeks, inflicting thousands more casualties, demonstrating tactical skill and defensive brilliance that impressed even American commanders. But Suribachi's fall signaled the beginning of the end. The fortress that was supposed to stop the Marines had been taken in 4 days. The message was clear. No position on Iwo Jima would hold. No defensive preparation would prove adequate. The Marines would take every objective regardless of cost. What Japanese defenders did not yet understand was that the fall of Suribachi represented only the beginning of their nightmare. The terrain ahead, stretching north toward the airfields and the island's rocky highlands, held defenses even more formidable than those that had protected the mountain. And the Marines, who had just demonstrated they could take Suribachi in 4 days, were about to prove they would fight for 32 more days with the same relentless intensity. The arithmetic that had doomed Japanese resistance on the mountain would apply with equal force to every position on Iwo Jima. The only questions were how long each position would hold and how many men would die taking it. February 24th, 1945. After the flag raising on Suribachi, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions pivoted north and began the advance toward Iwo Jima's central airfields and the rocky plateau beyond. The 3rd Marine Division, which had been held in reserve during the initial assault, came ashore and moved into position between the other 2 divisions. The American battle line now stretched across the entire width of the island with approximately 50,000 Marines committed to combat operations. Facing them were more than 18,000 Japanese defenders dug into defensive positions that represented the culmination of 9 months of preparation. Lieutenant Toshihiko Ono commanded an infantry company positioned in the highlands north of Airfield No. 2. His men occupied caves and bunkers connected by tunnels that ran deep into the volcanic rock. Each position had been carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire while remaining hidden from aerial observation. Artillery and mortar. Positions were positioned in caves where counter-battery fire could not reach them. Machine gun nests covered every approach from multiple angles. The defensive network was so extensive that destroying one position simply channeled attackers into kill zones covered by other weapons. General Kuribayashi had designed these defenses based on careful study of previous American amphibious operations, and every lesson learned from Tarawa to Guam had been incorporated into Iwo Jima's fortifications. What Kuribayashi could not design around was the fundamental difference in how American and Japanese forces approached the problem of reducing fortified positions. Japanese military doctrine emphasized infantry attacks, supported by artillery preparation, and followed by exploitation of breakthrough points. This approach assumed that defenders would eventually retreat or surrender when positions became untenable. Marines operated under no such assumption. They approached each bunker, each cave, each defensive position as a separate tactical problem to be solved through the systematic application of combined arms firepower. When infantry encountered resistance, they immediately called in supporting arms. Artillery batteries fired missions within minutes of receiving coordinates. Naval gunfire from destroyers and battleships offshore delivered shells with devastating accuracy. Aircraft bombed and strafed targets that ground forces marked with smoke grenades. Tanks advanced with infantry support to provide direct fire against positions that could not be destroyed by indirect fire. The result was a form of warfare that shocked Japanese defenders, who had expected conventional infantry tactics. Lieutenant Ono watched through his observation post as Marines advanced toward his company's positions on February 25th. The Americans moved slowly and methodically, with squads providing covering fire, while other units advanced by bounds. When his forward positions opened fire, the Marine advance stopped immediately. Within 5 minutes, artillery shells began falling on the exact locations where his machine guns were positioned. The accuracy was terrifying. American forward observers were calling in fire missions based on muzzle flashes and the brief glimpses of defensive positions that combat revealed. Counter-battery fire from Japanese artillery proved ineffective because Marine radar could track incoming shells and calculate the firing position's coordinates within seconds. By mid-afternoon, Marine tanks had reached effective range of Ono's defensive line. The Sherman medium tanks advanced in coordination with infantry squads that prevented Japanese soldiers from approaching with magnetic mines or satchel charges. The tanks engaged bunkers with 75mm guns and coaxial machine guns, methodically destroying positions that infantry could not reduce with small arms fire. When bunkers proved resistant to tank guns, demolition teams crawled forward under covering fire to place explosive charges. If positions still held out, flamethrower teams advanced to the firing ports and sent streams of burning liquid into the defensive works. The combination of firepower and systematic tactics meant that every Japanese position would eventually fall. The only question was how long resistance could be maintained and how many casualties could be inflicted before the position was overrun. Corporal Shigeru Yoshida manned a machine gun nest in a cave complex 200 yards behind the forward defensive line. His position was considered secure from direct assault because the only approach was across open ground swept by interlocking fire from multiple weapons. Japanese tactical doctrine held that such positions could be held indefinitely against infantry attack. What doctrine had not accounted for was the willingness of Marines to accept casualties that made such attacks possible. Yoshida watched through his gun sight as a Marine rifle. Platoon began advancing toward his position on the morning of February 26th. The first squad moved forward, using whatever cover the volcanic terrain provided. When Yoshida's gun opened fire, 3 Marines fell within seconds. The survivors took cover and returned fire while calling in supporting arms. Within minutes, smoke rounds began falling around Yoshida's position, obscuring his field of fire. Artillery shells crashed into the rock above his cave entrance, sending showers of stone fragments through the firing port. A Marine flamethrower team used the smoke cover to advance to within 30 yards of the position. Yoshida had never seen an American flamethrower in action, but Japanese intelligence reports had described the weapon in horrifying detail. He understood that his position was about to become an oven that would cook everyone inside alive. The choice was simple: die by fire or exit the bunker and die by bullets. Like most Japanese soldiers facing this decision, he chose to fight until the flames made continued resistance impossible, then died attempting to escape through a rear tunnel that Marines had already sealed with demolitions. This pattern repeated across the battlefield hundreds of times daily. Japanese positions that should have held for days fell within hours when confronted with systematic combined arms assault. Defenders who fought with desperate courage discovered that courage alone could not overcome the disparity in firepower and logistics that defined the battle. By the end of February, the Marines had secured both of Iwo Jima's completed airfields and were grinding forward through the highlands that formed the island's northern defensive zone. The advance was measured in yards per day, but it never stopped. Every position that fell weakened the overall defensive network. Every tunnel system that was cleared eliminated Japanese forces that could not be replaced. Private First Class Kenji Matsuda had survived 3 previous island battles before arriving on Iwo Jima as a replacement for casualties suffered during earlier campaigns. His experience taught him exactly what was coming when the Marines began their assault on his sector on March 1st. He had seen this script before on Saipan and Guam. The Americans would probe defenses with small unit attacks to identify strong points. Artillery would then systematically destroy identified positions, while infantry maintained pressure across the entire front. Tanks would advance to provide direct fire support. Flamethrowers would eliminate positions that conventional weapons could not reduce. The process would continue with mechanical inevitability until every defender was dead and the position had fallen. What made Iwo Jima different from previous battles was the intensity and duration of combat that Japanese defenses imposed on attacking forces. On Saipan, organized resistance had collapsed within 3 weeks. On Guam, Japanese forces had been scattered within similar time frames. On Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi's defensive network was so extensive and well prepared that Marines encountered fierce resistance for more than a month after landing. But the outcome remained mathematically determined. The Americans possessed unlimited ammunition, constant reinforcement, and overwhelming fire support. Japanese defenders had only the supplies they had stockpiled before the battle began, and the courage to die defending positions they knew could not be held. March 2nd, 1945. D+11. The Marines had been fighting continuously for 12 days, with casualties mounting at rates that shocked even experienced commanders. The 5th Marine Division, advancing up Iwo Jima's west coast, had suffered 5,500 casualties, reaching the island's northern plateau. The 4th Marine Division, grinding through the Central Highlands, reported similar losses. The 3rd Marine Division, committed to combat on D+4, had already suffered thousands of casualties, closing the gap between the other 2 divisions. The combined casualty rate exceeded anything experienced in previous Pacific campaigns, but the advance continued without pause. Replacement troops arriving from Guam and Saipan moved directly into combat positions, replacing fallen Marines and maintaining unit strength at levels necessary to sustain offensive operations. Captain Toshio Nakamura commanded the remnants of a Japanese infantry battalion defending Hill 362, a rocky prominence that dominated the surrounding terrain. His original force of 800 men had been reduced to fewer than 300 effectives through attrition caused by constant artillery bombardment and repeated marine assaults. Ammunition was running critically low. Food supplies had been exhausted days earlier. Medical supplies were non-existent, leaving wounded men to die in agony or commit suicide to avoid capture. Communications with higher headquarters had been severed, leaving Nakamura's battalion fighting in isolation without coordination or support from adjacent units. Yet the Marines attacking Hill 362 were suffering even higher casualty rates despite their advantages in firepower and logistics. Every yard gained cost lives. Every bunker destroyed required multiple assault attempts. The terrain favored defenders so completely that attacking forces had to advance across open ground, swept by machine gun fire from positions that could not be suppressed by artillery alone. The fighting devolved into the brutal mathematics of attrition warfare, where both sides accepted horrific casualties as the necessary cost of achieving objectives. Marines knew they would eventually take the hill because they had unlimited replacements and ammunition. Japanese defenders knew they would eventually die, but were determined to make the Americans pay the highest possible price before the position fell. The assault that finally broke Japanese resistance on Hill 362 began at dawn on March 3rd, with the heaviest artillery preparation Marines had employed since landing on Iwo Jima. For 2 hours, shells rained down on the hill from batteries positioned across southern Iwo Jima and from destroyers positioned offshore. The bombardment was followed by airstrikes that dropped napalm on suspected defensive positions. When Marine infantry finally advanced, they encountered resistance from Japanese soldiers who had survived the bombardment by retreating deep into tunnels during the shelling, then returned to fighting positions when the barrage lifted. This tactic had worked in previous battles to preserve defensive capabilities through preparatory bombardments. On Iwo Jima, Marines had learned to expect this response and had developed counter-tactics. Flamethrower teams accompanied the first assault waves, moving forward to spray burning liquid into cave entrances and tunnel systems before defenders could fully reoccupy fighting positions. Demolition teams followed immediately behind, sealing tunnel entrances with explosives that trapped Japanese soldiers underground. Tank infantry teams provided covering fire while these specialized units worked, accepting casualties from Japanese positions that remained operational but steadily reducing the defensive network's effectiveness. By nightfall on March 3rd, Hill 362 had fallen after 3 days of savage fighting that killed or wounded more than 5,000 Marines and eliminated Captain Nakamura's entire battalion. Sergeant Kazuo Yamada survived the battle for Hill 362 by hiding in a sealed tunnel system for 4 days after the position fell. He eventually emerged at night to scavenge for food and water, moving through terrain now controlled by Marines who patrolled constantly to eliminate Japanese holdouts. His diary, recovered after his death during a failed infiltration attempt, provided detailed observations about Marine combat capabilities that confirmed what Japanese military intelligence had been reporting since Guadalcanal. The Americans fought with a combination of aggressive tactics and overwhelming firepower that made defensive resistance ultimately futile, regardless of terrain advantages or fortification quality. What disturbed Yamada most was not American material superiority, which Japanese soldiers had come to expect, but the psychological commitment Marines demonstrated to mission accomplishment. He watched from hiding as Marine units that had suffered catastrophic casualties reorganized and continued attacking without waiting for orders or reinforcement. Squad leaders made tactical decisions with speed and confidence that suggested extensive training and command authority far beyond what Japanese doctrine delegated to non-commissioned officers. Individual Marines displayed initiative and adaptability that allowed them to exploit opportunities faster than Japanese commanders could respond. The cumulative effect was an enemy that operated at a tempo Japanese forces could not match even when defending from prepared positions with all advantages of terrain and fortification. The realization that swept through remaining Japanese defenders during the second week of March was that Iwo Jima would fall regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. The arithmetic was unsustainable. Every day of combat reduced Japanese strength, while American reinforcements maintained offensive capabilities at constant levels. Every position that fell weakened the defensive network in ways that could not be repaired. Every tunnel system that was sealed eliminated soldiers who could not be replaced. The mathematical certainty of defeat created a psychological crisis that manifested in different ways among different soldiers. Some fought with increased desperation, determined to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Others withdrew into fatalistic acceptance, performing their duties mechanically while awaiting the inevitable end. A few, though very few, began to consider surrender as preferable to meaningless death in a lost cause. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka represented the majority of Japanese soldiers who continued fighting despite understanding the hopelessness of their situation. He had been raised in a culture that emphasized duty and honor above survival. Japanese military training had reinforced these values through years of indoctrination that made surrender unthinkable. The code of Bushido that every soldier had internalized demanded death before dishonor. Capture meant not only personal shame, but disgrace to family and ancestors extending back generations. These psychological constraints were so powerful that Japanese soldiers consistently chose death over surrender, even when continuation of resistance served no military purpose, and death accomplished nothing except adding to casualty. Statistics. This determination to fight to the WTP's death regardless of circumstances created tactical challenges for Marines that profoundly influenced how the battle was fought. American military doctrine assumed that enemy forces would surrender when positions became untenable. Marines on Iwo Jima discovered that Japanese defenders would fight literally until killed. Then wounded survivors would continue resisting until physically incapable of pulling a trigger or throwing a grenade. This reality meant that clearing defensive positions required killing every defender rather than compelling surrender through demonstration of overwhelming force. The psychological impact on Marines who spent weeks killing men who would not surrender created trauma that many survivors carried for the rest of their lives. March 10th, 1945. D+19. The Marines had been fighting for 3 weeks with casualties exceeding 13,000, including 3,000 dead. Japanese resistance had been reduced to scattered strong points in the northern highlands where terrain and fortifications remained formidable despite constant American pressure. General Kuribayashi, who had commanded Japanese forces with tactical brilliance throughout the battle, established his final command post in a cave complex near Iwo Jima's northern coast. He understood that organized resistance could not continue much longer. Supply shortages had become critical. Ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone. Food was scarce. Communications had broken down. The defensive network he had created was being systematically destroyed, despite inflicting casualties that would have forced conventional enemies to halt operations and regroup. What Kuribayashi recognized was that his strategy had failed, not because Japanese tactics were flawed or because defenders lacked courage, but because Marines were willing to accept casualty rates that made Japanese defensive advantages irrelevant. The fortifications had worked as designed, inflicting terrible losses on attackers. The tunnel systems had provided protection from naval gunfire and air attacks. The defensive coordination had channeled Marines into kill zones covered by multiple weapons. Everything had functioned according to plan. But the Americans had simply absorbed the casualties and continued advancing with mechanical inevitability until Japanese defensive capabilities collapsed through attrition. The general's final messages to Imperial headquarters acknowledged this reality with unusual candor. He reported that Iwo Jima's defenders had accomplished their mission of delaying American operations and inflicting maximum casualties. But he also acknowledged that the battle demonstrated fundamental problems with Japanese defensive strategy that had implications for future operations. The Americans could not be stopped by making victory expensive. They possessed the industrial capacity to absorb losses and continue offensive operations at intensities Japanese forces could not sustain. More importantly, Marine combat capabilities had evolved far beyond previous intelligence estimates. The systematic application of combined arms tactics, the psychological commitment to mission accomplishment, and the tactical flexibility displayed by junior leaders created an enemy that could overcome any defensive position given sufficient time and resources. March 17, 1945. D+26. The island was officially declared secure, though fighting would continue for another week as Marines cleared remaining pockets of Japanese resistance. The statistics told a story of warfare so brutal that it defied easy comprehension. American casualties totaled more than 26,000, including 6,800 dead. This was the only Pacific battle where Marine casualties exceeded Japanese losses in raw numbers, though Japanese combat deaths of approximately 21,000 still outnumbered American deaths 3-1. Of the more than 20,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only 1,083 survived to be captured, most because they were unconscious or too severely wounded to commit suicide. The 28th Marine Regiment that had taken Mount Suribachi in 4 days had continued fighting for 33 additional days on the front lines. The regiment's total casualties exceeded 70%. Company E, which had raised both flags at Suribachi's summit, suffered losses of 75%. Of the 310 men who had landed with the company on D-Day, only 50 boarded ships when the regiment finally departed Iwo Jima. These casualty rates would have destroyed most military units' effectiveness. The 28th Marines maintained offensive operations throughout the campaign, demonstrating organizational resilience that amazed even experienced military observers. The cost of taking Iwo Jima sparked intense debate within American military and political circles about whether the island's strategic value justified the casualties. Critics argued that Iwo Jima's airfields could have been neutralized through continued aerial bombardment without requiring ground invasion. Supporters pointed to the emergency landing strip the island provided for damaged B-29 bombers returning from missions over Japan. By war's end, 2,400 B-29 seconds, carrying 27,000 crewmen, made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, potentially saving thousands of lives. Whether this justified the 6,800 Marines who died taking the island remained controversial decades after the war ended. What was not controversial among Japanese military analysts studying the battle was that Iwo Jima had demonstrated the impossibility of stopping American forces through defensive operations alone. The most carefully prepared fortifications in Pacific theater history had delayed Marines for 36 days, while inflicting catastrophic casualties. But the island had still fallen on schedule according to modified American timetables that accounted for the intensity of Japanese resistance. Every objective had been taken. Every airfield had been secured. The defensive masterpiece that Kuribayashi had created had accomplished nothing except adding to casualty lists on both sides. Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto's diary, found in his bunker after the battle, provided one of the most comprehensive Japanese accounts of what it felt like to face Marines throughout the 36-day campaign. His final entries, written during the last days of organized resistance, captured the psychological collapse that accompanied recognition of inevitable defeat. He wrote, "The Marines do not stop. We kill them, and more arrive. We destroy their tanks and more advance. We hold positions that should be impregnable, and they take them anyway. There is no defense against an enemy with unlimited resources and unlimited determination. We were told spirit conquers material. This is false. The Marines have spirit equal to ours, plus material advantages we cannot match. There was never any hope. There was only death." Yamamoto died on March 24th when Marines sealed his bunker with explosives. His body was never recovered. Like thousands of other Japanese defenders, he simply vanished into the volcanic rock that became his tomb. There would be no memorial, no recognition, no acknowledgement of his sacrifice, beyond a name on a list of soldiers who died defending an island that Japan could not hold against an enemy they could not stop. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.